Good morning to all of you, and thank you for joining this panel on changing aid architecture in a world of crisis. Today, more than one-third of global ODA is allocated to countries in conflict or fragile situations where humanitarian needs keeps rising. 1 out of 5 countries face today fiscal and financial stress. The global aid system has become highly fragmented and its components highly dispersed, which lead to aid volatility, loss of ownership, and most importantly, issues of accountability to the affected populations. I am delighted today to have with us panelists who are subject matter experts on the topic of international aid. So please meet Papa Amadou Sarr, who is the Executive Director of the Mobilization, Partnership and Communication Department at the AFD. Papa Amadou has 15 years of international development with a focus on the involvement of the private sector. He's been working with the UNDP in Paris, the OCDE, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and has been also in Senegal Minister for Women and Youth Entrepreneurship. We also have with us Mr. Eric Pelowski, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Rockefeller Foundation, who is also a veteran of over 16 years of government services in the United States, especially with the Department of State. And we also have with us Franck Bousquet, Deputy Director at the IMF, coordinating engagement with fragile and conflict-affected states. And he was previously the Senior Director of the World Bank, Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group. So before we start with some questions, I would like to welcome Papa Amadou to give us a small welcome word introduction. Thank you.
Well, Anna, thank you so much, Alia, and I'm very happy to be here today presenting our Director General, Remy Rieu, and say that it's a pleasure for us to be organizing this panel the third time within the Paris Peace Forum. And we're very happy to be having today Eric and Frank sharing this panel with me, and Alia, who is a practitioner, will come back to experiences we've been having with them in Lebanon. And in a nutshell, what I wanted to say is a little bit of publicity, of course. We've published this book recently, a week ago, calling Official Development Assistance at the Age of Consequences. In it, you will find our reflections on the aid architecture in a context of multi-crisis we're facing today, be it climate, be it military, be it fragility, and all sorts of crises the world is facing today. And I'm happy to have colleagues from OECD here because we've been talking about the aid architecture, the way it worked over the last 60 years, and now how it is facing, and with the multidimensionality of the crisis, how we could overcome crisis together. And very thrilled to be sharing this panel with both IMF and Rockefeller Foundation and Alia, and stay tuned for the next hour. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Papa Amadou. I would like to turn first to you, Frank, and ask you, how do you see the fragility and conflict landscape, and what are the associated costs of the situation?
All right, well, thank you, Elia, and very happy to be here as well, clearly. And I think this session is maybe the most relevant session of the entire Paris Peace Forum. Why? Let me tell you why. The over themes is overriding multi-crisis. And which countries do you believe are facing a perfect storm in terms of dealing with all type of crises? Looking at debt, looking at inflations, looking at COVID crisis. Some countries are facing Ebola crisis, let's not forget. Looking as well of the impact of the Russian war in Ukraine. Those are, for us, the most vulnerable members, which are about 20% of our membership at the IMF, about 40 countries. Those are the fragile and conflict-affected states. So indeed, the fragility landscape is not improving, it's deteriorating. If you looking at different numbers, clearly the forecast is to have about 350 million people that will be living by 2030 in fragile and conflict-affected states. Is that a lot? Well, 10% of the population, but 60% of the global poor. So, in terms of focusing, it's very important that we don't forget about those countries that are facing unique challenge. Challenge, of course, that are all complex, especially when you are dealing with crises, but are quite unique. Because in addition to all the challenges that you typically have in low-income or middle-income countries, it's about lack of trust between institutions and populations, lack of ability to provide basic services, security, and obviously this has an impact significantly in the way that aid has to be delivered and the way that you are supporting those countries by tailoring and understanding what are really the challenge, but also the constraints that you need to take into account before providing any support. Let's go in terms, since your question is about the landscape, if you look at forced displacement, again, that was correctly mentioned. We heard yesterday again, latest number from UNHCR, 100 million people that are forced displaced. By the way, 75% are in low-income, middle-income countries. And that's a 15% more than last year, which is significant. If you look at food security, just looking at all the type of crises and all the impact of the fragility and conflict. If you look at food security, which has been obviously clearly exacerbated by the Russian war in Ukraine, we have about 350 million people that are facing acute food insecurity. And about 50%, by the way, of those people are living in fragile and conflict-affected states. Our latest research at the IMF, just a few months ago, shows that the impact of the increase of food, of the price of food and fertilizer is about $9 billion on the balance of payments of the 48 countries the most impacted for 2022 and 23. So clearly the costs are significant, the spillover as well. Let's not forget that dealing with fragility and conflict is a global public good. That means you are supporting those countries and those people, but also you are addressing something that has spillover to neighboring countries, impacting the stability of neighboring countries and neighboring regions as well. So that's where we stand in terms of the landscape. Definitely worrisome, but also which means that it's more important than ever for the international community to try to see how to provide financing, but beyond the financing, how to adapt, tailor, and clearly understand the specific challenge that those countries are facing and what does it mean in terms of providing support to them.
Totally, and just to reflect upon what you were just saying and related to the context of my country, Lebanon, for example, I think it's very important to highlight the speed of how it's fast changing. And if we look at Lebanon, that was classified as a middle-income country back in 2019, that is today about to be classified as a humanitarian country, humanitarian crisis country, things are moving very fast. And indeed, it is this type of new multi-crisis that is changing our approach towards what's happening. And just to complement with what Franck was just saying, Papa Amadou, I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the ways in which ODA has been adapted or not to the new profile of crisis that emerged in the last couple of years?
Well, it's interesting to have a set back on the origins of ODA back in 16 when it was created. The objective was to not last, obviously, to help countries that were war-torn to, become more, how can I say, resilient. And at the end of the day, it have become, how could I say, everlasting so far. Today, we're still talking about official development assistance across the globe. And what is interesting is also to see the evolution of ODA. More than 30% of official development assistance in general is directed towards fragile states or conflict-torn countries. And as Frank said, this is something that we will need to still stick together. But the objective would be to see how we could overcome the dependence of the countries on ODA, or to see the shift it should take to become more productive, more impactful, rather than just this dependence that exists between those donor and recipient countries. To add to that, as you said, the multidimensionality of the crisis, taking into account war, other conflicts, but also now climate. We have refugees thanks to or due to climate issues across the globe, in Africa, in the Sahel region, in Asia, in Latin America, but in Europe, Ukraine, you name it. And today, the importance of to look at the way we frame the aid, or I would say ODA, to address those multidimensionality of the crisis is first to see how we could not only take into account the needs of the countries. You will come back to it with the case of Lebanon, work we're doing with the Shabake initiative to give a clear, how can I say, illustration of what's happening in Lebanon, which is an affected country where you have all the facets of this multidimensionality of the crisis, and to see how the program we're doing together to support livelihoods, youth, women, through microfinance and other support to livelihoods has helped to promote, to support people, families in Lebanon. And I would also terminate saying that today we have to face it and say it clearly. There's a lot of hypocrisy around the aid itself. Not only sometimes it doesn't reach the commitments, the 0.7. Few countries, maybe the northern countries of Europe reach those indicators. Not only that, but also the way it is directed towards the countries to address the key sectors that it aims, not taking into account the fragility, the emerging crisis that happens, and from time to time, the countries that bargain to target the aid into each XYZ sector, be it conflict, be it agriculture, be it education, be it health. In a nutshell, that's what the discussion we've been having, we had in this paper, to see how to rethink the whole aid architecture to address the needs of the evolution of the world, which is facing all these crises. And we are in the heart of that, and then I think the discussion we'll be having here and beyond will be very helpful to help that. And with a concrete example of Lebanon, when you come back to that, you will see.
Thank you, Papa Amadou, and I will jump on this to definitely highlight what you've been saying. And clearly in Lebanon now what we're saying is that there's clear two tracks in terms of aid. One of it is more tracked towards responding to humanitarian needs, and then the other one more related to continue having economic, and social development. And I don't like the word nexus, to be honest with you, but I think that clearly we have those two tracks. And one of the things that is being currently implemented in Lebanon with the Shabake project, implemented in partnership with Agence France and funded by the AFD, is basically to be able to answer to both the humanitarian needs and the development needs, so related to the SDGs, in the ability of serving not only the Lebanese host community, but also the refugees, and also to be able to tackle different sectors, as you were mentioning. Could it be education, economic development, health? So it is really encompassing a lot of sectors. And just, Eric, I'm turning to you to ask you. So we know that in September there has been the proposals of those Bridgetown agenda in Barbados, and it is basically meant to tackle the reform of the global financial architecture. What are those proposals?
Sure. Let me try and help you with that, and thank you for having this panel. Franck said that this is the most important panel of the session of the PPF, and I would also say that you should be the most disappointed, because instead of having Prime Minister Mia Mottley, you're stuck with me trying to explain the Bridgetown agenda. It was announced at the UN General Assembly this fall, but it really started in late July when Prime Minister Mottley and Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed convened in Barbados a small retreat with a few countries and a little bit of help from experts to try and say, we have this multi-crisis, we have debt, we have inflation, we have And in fact, the debt is sort of staggering. If you think about it, in April, just after the Ukrainian war started, President of the World Bank, David Malpass, said that over 60% of the poorest countries are either in debt distress or are going to face it very soon. And that's the case in April. It's now been, what, 5-6 months, and we're only in a worse position with worse economics that they're facing. So you also have a food crisis, you also have a fuel crisis. So these countries, and you have climate as the snowball that rolls down the hill to hit all of these countries. So Prime Minister Motley, Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General, had the insight to try and pull together a group and pull together some proposals to try and address Bretton Woods, the system of financial architecture that helps or is intended to help the countries around the world. And there were about 4 major groups of proposals, and each of them has 5 or 6 underneath them. So I'll be very quick about talking about them. First was to deliver emergency liquidity and support to these countries that are facing fiscal challenges. The second was to fix the multilateral development banks, because there are a number of possibilities where we could get more bang for our bucks at the multilateral development banks. The G20 convoked a commission to actually look at how to do that, and they came through with 5 major proposals to change the way multilateral development banks operate. The third was to take on the debt crisis using SDRs and a number of other tools. And the fourth was to try and really look at the collision, because Prime Minister Motley has a country that is literally on the front lines of a war on climate change. You know, she talks very eloquently about the risk to her country in you know, really concrete terms. And so a couple of the proposals within the Bridgetown Initiative are a climate mitigation trust fund, and also a new way of approaching loss and damage. And these proposals are very concrete and very actionable.
Thank you very much, Eric, for this. Frank, in your previous experience, you've been implementing a number of new, one could say some of them innovative financial mechanisms. So referring to this $25 billion International Development Association that was financing packages for the poorest country, or for example, also you worked on implementing the Global Concessional Financing Facility. And now that you are at the IMF, in March 2022, the IMF adopted the strategy for fragile and conflict-affected states. So how is the IMF currently, as a multilateral donor, adjusting its financial mechanisms, or how do you tend to respond to the needs of the vulnerable countries?
So, and then I would like maybe to rebound on some of the sorry for that. And then I would like maybe to rebound on some of the good points Eric and Pavlidou mentioned. So regarding the IMF, I mean, obviously we are one piece of a much bigger puzzle. So humility is good. When you look at the size of the challenge, of the issue, let's put things in perspective. We are trying to do our part. What does that mean? It means that when you look at helping those countries that are qualified as the most vulnerable, because basically they are facing the perfect storm, dealing with climate change, a significant number of the countries, the most vulnerable, by the way, of the 35 most vulnerable to climate change, are fragile and conflicted states. I mentioned about the pandemics, I mentioned about so many other crises. So we're trying to do, what can we do for those countries? So it's not only about financing, I will say it, but it's also questions about how to best tailor, how to support, by taking into account the specific challenge that those countries are facing. Those countries, again, represent 20% of our membership. So the IMF is not the bank, the IMF is not the Red Cross, the IMF is not the AFD. We have a specific mandate, and we remain in our mandate. The whole point, I'm not sure also about Nexus, but the whole point is to break silo. So it's about recognizing that in those countries, if you are not working with bilateral donors, with the countries that, by the way, are in a driving seat, okay, but also with civil society, private sector, that is so important, working with peace security actors, it's going to be very difficult. So the whole point about the strategy aims to say two things. First, it's very important to link between macroeconomic stability and exiting fragility. So the IMF is focusing on macroeconomic stability. Obviously, this is not the development actors, and we're trying to see what does that mean when we are supporting those countries. So in the strategy that was adopted last March, with clear support from our board, but also with it's not just a piece of paper, they are concrete measures. One, it's about to be more present on the ground. Not to become a humanitarian organization. That's precisely what we don't want to do. We want to leverage the Oxfam, the Red Cross, all the key civil society organizations, all the UN systems, all the presence on the ground to get better intelligence, better understand. But by being on the ground, it allows us to actually first provide more regular support to the country authorities that are on the driving seats, let's not forget. So therefore, we are going to increase the number of res rep, increasing our presence in fragile states, but also hiring 40 local economists in each of these countries, also having more experts on capacity development, which is so important. Let's not forget that when you look at sound and accountable macro-fiscal monetary institution, this is key from preventing fragility to turn into failures. So the whole point is really to say, how can we best support the authorities in terms of strengthening the capacity of the institutions, and that includes by having more colleagues, experts in countries or in our regional centers. So there is one bucket of this strategy which aims to say the type of support for those countries needs to be adapted, and therefore more presence on the ground to really more in constant interactions with our counterpart, better understand the constraints they are facing. You remember the point that I was mentioning, when you have issue of security, of legitimacy of the state across the territory, when you are dealing with lack of social contracts, don't you think this has an impact on the type of support needs to be provided? Big time. So that's why we're trying to better grasp with all the humility needed and interacting more with other partners. The second point is about tailoring. Tailoring means that we are looking not only at how to work in the next 8, 10 months, 1 year, but more about the 2, 3 next years by better understand again what are the root cause of fragility. It's super important, because otherwise you can provide financing over financing. The root cause of fragility, leveraging, of course, our sister organization with whom we are working super closely, the World Bank, but also other partners, whether the UN, whether it could be also AFD, whether it could be any other organization, to really understand in terms of governance, in terms of capacity constraints, in terms of elite capture, what does that mean in terms of the reform that may be fantastic on a paper, but that may not be implemented over the next 2, 3 years. So what does it mean in terms of focusing our support on what is the most important and where there is probably opportunity to make a difference at this stage? So it's quite important. It's really recognizing, as I said, it's not only a question of amount of financing, I will come back to it, but I look more also about the tailoring to better understand the specific issue, the constraints, and therefore better adapting it, including in terms of the mode of delivery, which consists of being more present on the ground. And the last aspect that I mentioned in this strategy is about, of course, this point about the partnership, and that's linked with the humility. When you look at the challenge of those countries that I mentioned, they are not only complex. Every country is facing a complex challenge, but it's also they are quite unique, and therefore working much more with peace, security, humanitarian organization is key. Concrete example, you look at food security, and you may have seen some joint statement between the heads of institutions of the World Bank, WTO, WFP, FAO, and IMF. Why? Because it's not only a question of fixing a balance of payment. It's also looking at the trade restrictions. Guess what? That's WTO. It's looking as well at providing food. Well, that's humanitarian. It's FAO, it's WFP. It's about fixing and helping countries to be more resilient and to improve their own agriculture to be on the driving seats, so they are not relying on imports. This is support from the bank. So you can see this whole partnership, which is working at the corporate level, but also at the country level. So when we are supporting countries looking at how to best provide advice in our program on social safety net, guess what? It's about relying on other organizations, World Food Programme, World Bank, Africa Development Banks, about what do they know about the sector expertise that we don't have. And I could quote, other examples where we are really working closely. When you look, for instance, forced displacement, as I was mentioning, forced displacement can be macro-critical. Now, do we have the expertise at the IMF on refugee crisis and forced displacement? Not. And therefore, working very closely with UNHCR and trying to better understand what does that mean in terms of the impact of refugee crisis for the countries, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's about Colombia from Venezuela. And that's why this partnership is not nice on a piece of paper only, but it's actually on the ground, making sure that our mission chief, our res reps are really engaging with humanitarian organizations, peace, security actors, to better understand what are the constraints, and how we can be more efficient in terms of providing support. The last point is financing. I say it, but you see the whole point is it's not just about financing. I thought it was important to shape the type of support needed instead of just putting some numbers. Financing, of course, we are scaling up support. We provided just over the past years in response to the COVID crisis that hit big time those fragile and conflict-affected states, more than $16 billion to those countries, in addition to that we're covering about 24 of them, in addition to $16 billion of SDR allocations. We have created a food shock window to provide support for those countries responding to food security crises, and we set up a resilience and sustainability trust to also support those low-middle countries that are facing climate change. So we are trying to look at the type of financing that will be helping to address those specific challenges, in addition to the major scale-up and response that was provided over the past years in response to the COVID. As I mentioned, those countries will see their per capita income of 2019 recover only in 2024. So the whole point is that the risk of divergence, there is a risk of clearly divergence between those countries and the rest of the world, and this is why we are scaling up our engagement with those countries. But as you saw, as you heard from me today, it's not just by providing financing. Yes, we are doing our part, but it's also trying to see how can we best improve our efficiency and impact, including with all the other actors, because we are just one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Thank you very much, Frank, for this. Eric, I see you nodding, and I think that you maybe want to reflect upon what just said? Please, but your mic.
Just one thing on that. I'm absolutely convinced that Frank and his colleagues are doing what they can within the existing system. But the fact of the matter is, the amount of stimulus, and I'm sure that he can give you the numbers, the amount of stimulus that the low-income and middle-income countries had access to as compared to the developed countries, it's not even in the same universe. And it's up to the shareholders of these institutions to create new circumstances in which the bank and the IMF can do more, because the current structure has limitations that are not dealing with the scale of the problem. Developing countries had double-digit stimulus in response, and the developing countries had single-digit and barely break the surface of the ocean kind of responses to the crisis that the pandemic caused. And so it's really upon the burden of the shoulders of the shareholders, the major shareholders, to change the environment that Frank is working in order to actually make a considerable difference to these countries. Otherwise, there's severe limitations on what can be done.
I totally agree. And again, if I can reflect upon what's happening in Lebanon, clearly the response has to be multidimensional and with multi-actors. This is for sure. And then something very important you mentioned, Frank, is that there is no one size fits all. We need to adapt and to tailor to the needs of the different states, countries that we're working with. And clearly, so as an example, in Lebanon, so we're experiencing a very complex and fragmented aid architecture. We have at least 3 frameworks that, as practitioners, we have to deal with. So we have an LCRP, that is a Lebanon crisis response plan that was put in place to answer the Syria crisis and the influx of refugees. We have the LHF, that is the Lebanon Humanitarian Fund, that tackles to more of the humanitarian need. And now, lately, there has been the 3RF, that is basically called the Lebanon Reform, Recovery and Reconstruction, that is being funded by a pool. It's a pool fund from different international donors and managed by the EU, the UN, and the World Bank jointly. And I think that clearly having so many frameworks, it has negatively impacted the ability to respond to the needs of all populations in Lebanon. And it has been undermining the quality and the accountability of the response. So I think that therefore we need to really have something that is tailored. At the same time, we can say that in Lebanon, we're still kind of a laboratory where we're trying new initiatives, new innovative financial mechanisms, and probably will be able to learn very soon from, what is the results? What can we take as a lessons learned? What are the best practices that could be replicated in other parts of the world? And just to go back to you, Papa Amadou, because I think we've been talking a lot about UN agencies, development banks, the IMF, government, but I think that there is a missing part in the equation that is the private sector. So actually, and from your previous experience, I know that you've been working a lot already in trying to have this linkages between development and private sector. I would be happy to hear from you, your reflection on this.
Yeah, prior to coming back to that, to the private sector, I would really like to comment a little bit on what Eric and Frank said. To mention, as you said, there's no one size fits all. And this experience you gave about Lebanon, which is currently facing multidimensional crisis, is something we can use to say it is not only countries like Lebanon that are facing this complexity of aid architecture. I come from a country called Senegal. You have in West Africa and all countries, YMU or ECOWAS region, different actors intervening in the aid architecture. EU, bilateral donors, US, foundations, civil society. And as a government official, you have to face with different frameworks from each donor. And you have to comply with the rules and expectations of each country or each bilateral or multilateral organization in terms of, reporting, in terms of application, in terms of usage. And at the end of the day, you would end up disbursing less than 50% of the resources if you're capable. What does it say? And at the end, my colleagues, my former colleagues at OECD would say, those countries don't have the capacity to absorb all the resources that are addressed. But if they don't have the capacity to absorb, maybe there is something that was missing in the way they've received the resources, the way the government officials are, hijacked by, different partners in terms of using mine or yours, et cetera, it's really complex. And just to, tell you, it's not only Lebanon, but it's all the low and middle income countries and the work that done by IMF in terms of capacity development, capacity building of administration, tax administration, in terms of resource mobilization, help. But there is still something lagging behind. And I want to also say that with the Bridgetown initiative, we're very supportive of it. At the IFD, we launched the Financing Common Summit. Actually, the first edition was here in Paris. And then we've just done the third one in Abidjan, where we were a couple of weeks ago. And then we recognize the objective of PM Motley, and then call as well, and we've been talking about that 3 weeks ago at the World Bank at the annual meeting, for the reform of the multilateral different banks in addressing effectively the needs of the countries we serve in terms of allocating, I'll come back to that, to the SDR, and having a multiplier effect to addressing poverty, climate challenges and crisis and hunger. We've seen countries that are, starving with the food crisis that happened because of the crisis in Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot to be done. And responding to your question, the role of the private sector is key. In September, we had a very interesting panel with the Center of Global Development. We had people from the private sector, namely JP Morgan, with whom we're discussing in the way of addressing SDGs with impact bonds, et cetera. And one sentence that struck me was someone from, I think her name, I forgot her name, but she was mentioning that you guys, bilateral agencies, multilateral agencies, all those donor countries, you making too much noise compared to what the private sector, the banks, are putting in terms of billions of dollars yearly to address the needs of development in countries, be it in infrastructure, be it in productive sectors, be it in agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, there is a way of integrating the private sector into the whole system of aid architecture restructuring in order to attract more resources, do more co-financing schemes, more blend finance schemes, and then stop the only way of aid assistance in terms of grants, and which will create a dependence forever. But using smart mechanisms of, making blend finance and making, sure that the resources that are affected go to the right sectors and are monitored effectively, are evaluated, and then using the private sector to create, the bridge and make more impact, it's something that would be terrific.
Oh, well, I have to admit, this is music to my ear, and I hope that you will be heard, because being a microfinance practitioner for the past 25 years in Lebanon, clearly with the crisis that we've been facing since 2019, there has been an influx of grants and assistance money, which is very much needed, but for a certain amount of time. I mean, it's very important then not to just shift to a complete humanitarian aid assistance type, and therefore we're very much advocating for keeping in mind a blended finance, approach, at least for a transitory phase, so that we can then go back into development per se. And one of the things that we're implementing under this Shabake project that is financed by the AFD is basically to make sure that we can, with farmers, with small producers, with micro, small and medium enterprises, to actually allow for a blended finance approach rather than simply grants. So definitely. And Eric, on the philanthropy side, being with the Rockefeller Foundation, so can you tell us what is the interest and the role of philanthropy in this whole agenda we've been discussing?
Sure, I'd happy to. Look, the Rockefeller Foundation was founded 100 years ago to better humanity. And so most of our work is in nutrition, it's in health, it's in energy access. We do some gender work. And all of those things require more resources than the Rockefeller Foundation could ever have. So the proper functioning of the World Bank, the proper functioning of the bilateral aid, the proper functioning of regional development banks contributes to all of the causes, all of the work that we're doing. So that's our interest. Our interest is that we're working together, and if we're the, we have to have smart money alongside us, and that's the private sector, it's the donor countries, it's the banks. So that's our interest. In terms of what we see our role as, our president, Dr. Raj Shah, is convinced that our role is to provide risk capital, and I would add to that risk diplomacy, but where we're trying to be brave and bold and do things that governments have to follow along because they have a different set of equities that they're balancing, a different set of relationships. Philanthropies can fail. Philanthropies can try stuff, and if it doesn't work, they start over. I know our president has talked about how we worked in Mexico for 10 years in agriculture and failed for 10 years straight, and eventually contributed to the development of dwarf wheat, and the dwarf wheat revolutionized production and yield. So we're not afraid to fail. We're there to come up with things that work, and that means, like entrepreneurship, it means failing. But what I would say in this case is we have provided assistance to both the Bridgetown Initiative, the retreat that happened, but also to the Capital Adequacy Review report that came out by the G20. And that is a remarkable report which talks about adding hundreds of billions of dollars to what the World Bank, what the IMF, to what the regional development banks can do simply by changing the way they use their balance sheets. And that means looking at callable capital, that means looking at headroom, that means looking at transparency, it looks at private capital mobilization. There is a tremendous amount in this G20 report, Commission report, that would allow for, without an increase in capital to the bank and to the regional developing banks, to do more with the existing money.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. And I think that one key word that was mentioned by Frank is, I think, humility. And maybe I will not be politically correct, but I think that sometimes some of the big players have to maybe put their ego aside or their personal agenda and try to really to coordinate, cooperate better with others, because again, from the voice of the field, what is important for us is our accountability to the affected people. It's about remaining people-centric, and I think that this is something that is dear to our hearts all over the world. One thing that maybe we haven't been tackling much related to the aspect of localization, maybe Frank, you did by telling us that the IMF is willing to come closer in each country, have better representation on the ground. I think that there is also, it's a work in progress about what is the definition of localization, how do we involve more also the local actors, could it be local NGOs, local CSOs, in having a say maybe in the design of those solutions that we're trying to identify. So definitely also in Lebanon we're having a lot of initiatives that are happening around localization, and we'll be very soon sharing with many of the donors and key stakeholders some of the recommendations and findings that we have and that we believe would apply in any other context, any other country in the world. If you don't mind, unless you would like to have some reflections, I think it would be good if we can open the floor to the audience if you have any questions.
I like very much the intervention of Papa Sarr first, where he called to us the origin of the system of aid. Now, we are confronted probably with a series of systemic problems. Let me just quote the fact that the worst crisis before the war, there was COVID, saw official development assistance increasing only 3%, between 3 and 5%. Now, if, in other terms, the system is not capable to react, what could be the major problem of the system, not the adjustment within the system? And I raise my question by saying, don't we also have a problem of governance? At present, the system of aid is discussed and decided on rules that are defined in tables where traditional donors sit. No China, no India, no other countries are sitting at the table. No foundation are sitting at the table. And therefore, don't we have to reform also the legitimacy of the system of aid? And let me just, I see here Sachin, which is representing Greece and India, and obviously is not necessarily at those tables. President Macky Sall recently repeated two traditional requests of developing countries. First, a permanent seat in the Security Council, and second, a permanent seat of Africa in G20. These are examples of things that could be done. Don't you think so? What do you think about it?
Thank you very much for this question. Maybe if you don't mind, we take a couple of other questions before we answer.
Hello? Hello? You can hear me. Okay, that's good. My name is Firas Shamsan. I'm from Yemen. I'm really glad to join this conference. During the aid helping, you know, like when people speaking about war, as a journalist came from Yemen, I flew out. 8 years of war, it was nothing for the people. When you talk about helping, you know, like when you speak about countries having conflicts, like Yemen, Lebanon, and then the biggest issue when we talk about humanitarian aid, like I see that myself, you know, like what you're gonna do, you just go and give some food, some oil, and you go, you say you helped. It is happening from all the help. When you talk about financial aid, you give the money. Most of the money doesn't go to directly to help the country, it go to way. Number one, like if you say the UN will send 1 million, you can say 80% of it will go as salaries, as experience from someone out. The rest of it will go to the corruption. Like I'm from Yemen. Yemen is the worst hunger situation made by by people. We are rich, we have oil, we have gas, but we never know where it's going. Government is stealing this, and they buy apartments in Turkey, in Egypt, and many countries. When you talk about corruption, if you go to Sana'a, where it's like Houthis, this group, militia group, where they take the aid, they force, I see it, it's happening to me myself, we try to help people, they take the humanitarian aid from you, they take it from you, they say, we will not allow the UN to give it directly to the people, and they only give it to the people who's following them, who's supporting them. This is happening in Iraq, this is happening in Somalia, and also in Lebanon. Lebanon have a big crisis. In the same time, where people cannot have the money from the banks, in the same time, one of the most richest people is a Lebanese. So this is the conflict. It is about corruption. Like when you are working in giving money, it's like, you know, like if you see people drowning in the sea and you save the first one and second one, you see another one, you bring it. You always save the people down, but you don't look who's in the top of the hill pushing people out. This is the situation. This is the corruption that it's happening, and it's a business. If you want to stop war, if you want to stop refugees to come to your country, stop selling weapons. If you give the bad people's weapons and they hit us, they kill us, and then you ask, why did you come? We have a crisis. We don't have a food to share. We have a food to share. Imagine when we see now the situation with Ukraine, we discover that Ukraine, this is a small country no one was taking care about, and how it affects the world. It is like this. If we work in corruption and we cut this corruption. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your intervention. I think it's also related a lot to this grassroots, addressing the grassroots of any crisis or conflict. We will come back to your question. Another question?
Hello, thank you for this panel. I just had, my question was a bit related to the Lebanese case study, since we talked about it. And we talked about also trying to get off the humanitarian aid eventually at some point. I wanted to ask about just the recent agreement that had happened. Do you think this can be a factor that can lead us to be a self-sustainable country with less humanitarian aid? For example, like what do we need to get to that point from where we are now to like we were at a certain point in our glory days, let's say. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question.
Yes, thank you. The U.S. Federal Reserve has raised interest rates 6 times this year already. For developing countries such as mine, Colombia, this means greater fiscal stability, a mess with currency exchange, meaning also a rise in prices for imported goods, and also capital reallocation back to the U.S. from countries that are perceived as less stable, such as Colombia. This means that you guys' work is hindered or counteracted. So my question would be, what can international aid architecture do to counteract this very real problem, which is an aggressive behavior from the Fed?
Thank you. I think that we will have a first round of answer by our panelists to those 4 questions. So a question around representation, another one around the grassroots and the corruption. Lebanon's case I will probably deal with, and then the question around the US Federal Reserves and the impact. You would like to start?
Yeah, I can start with the Mario's question. And I could not agree more with him. Not because he was my professor and boss at OECD for 5 years, but because he's right. He's right in 2 ways. My current former boss, the president of Senegal, as chair of African Union and heading to G20 tomorrow, and back from 27 has the sole argument of representation. And today, I'm 42, but if you look at what happened at the Bretton Woods institutions, setting, it is now more than time that the voices of the South, we can mention it, or Africa, is heard, both at UN General Assembly. And this is not very diplomatically correct, but I said to the president once, you know what you heads of states have to do? Once they invite you in September, October at the General Assembly of UN, all the African countries, 52, you don't go. You just don't go. You left your seats empty. And you see which countries will be sitting there at UN talking on behalf of UN, but for which UN? And then once they do that, you do that once, twice, and it gets out publicly everywhere, people will see, oh, okay, maybe they should be having a voice and be represented at the Security Council. And he looked at me, he said, you're naive, but we'll get there once. Because at the end of the day, you have to push and ask for it and grab it. If not, they will never give it to you. Because it's a gentleman's club. It's the same thing with the aid. Who pays? Dictate. At the end of the day, if you're sitting in a DAC, now I'm criticizing Mario and OECD, where you design, you implement, you decide how to allocate the resources, where it goes, how it should be used, and reporting, and the developing countries that are recipient don't have a word to say. And then it comes to the question about Lebanon. At some point, you take what you're given, because it's aid. It is not a loan, and it is not coming from private sector. And for me, as a development specialist over the last 15 years, and if you look at the literature about aid has not developed a single country so far, except from the Marshall Plan, where billions of dollars were poured into war-torn Europe to, reconstruct, rebuild it, and as it is being done now, and it will be done in Ukraine. But at some point, we have to know that aid is a link, is a diplomatic tool, and it also is a tool to have a country that you depend on. Colonialism and other things are linked to it, and then at some point, to get out of that link, you really need to grow your own private sector, to build your own tax systems, Frank will say, to mobilize more local resources and say, okay, we have 60 to 80% of our infrastructure development financed through local mobilization, local taxes, rather than international aid that will everywhere dictated in the way it will have to be used, because you are receiving it from a country. And in that country, they have a perspective. They have their own approach. They have their own strategy. You have to respect. And, I'm going to stop there. G20 is another obvious issue, Mario. Obviously, it cannot continue the way it is. And as you said, India is here, Brazil, China, Turkey, all those countries are becoming today traditional partners of the developing countries and fragile states, especially in Africa, that helping them grow the infrastructure. Today I heard from RFE in the morning that China is joining the renegotiation of debt of Chad. Thanks God, because China has been left so far, maybe willingly, but at some point you have to have all those actors, China, Turkey, Russia, and other actors that are aid contributors to engage the debt of those countries and help them grow.
Thank you very much, Papa Amadou, for this. Frank, just probably you also want to reflect upon this and maybe on the question that was asked related to corruption and government.
Sure. So just building on Papa Amadou's point, I think you could add also private creditors in addition to the others, because everybody needs to be around the table. I think you make an excellent point. And also the point, by the way, about recognizing that countries, I said it twice, I would say 3 times, are on the driving seat. And therefore the whole point is about strengthening and helping in building institutions. the whole point about our work, as you know, is not just looking at the IMF as providing financing or providing Article 4 that are measuring the health of the economy, but it's also about providing capacity development to have sound macroeconomic fiscal institutions. If you don't have, in which area? Domestic revenue mobilization. One way, by the way, not to be relying on aid is to have raising revenue, which is so important. So the whole point about what we are trying to do is really focusing on the fundamental, tax policy, banking regulation. Why? Not only for those countries to be truly in the driving seats and to be more resilient for future shocks, but also to be able to bring the private sector. Because if you don't have a correct law in terms of banking regulation, or in terms if you don't have the right tax policy and enough resource mobilized internally, I can tell you, private sector will hesitate twice before coming in. So that's what we are focusing. But the ultimate objective, indeed, is to unlock the financing from the private sector. And it was an excellent point that Papa Amadou mentioned. On corruption, fully agree 100%, but let me tell you on what. So we are not humanitarian actors, so when you are saying, when you provide humanitarian funds, you should check. I will not respond on this point. However, the importance of governance challenge or corruption, to say it clearly, in many of those countries is super important. Not only to make sure that you are safeguarding the funds that are being provided, because at the end of the day, it's about helping people, let's make it clear, but also I would say to better understand at the country level, because we should not put all the countries in the same bucket. It's very easy to say you have governance challenge in all those countries. So what we try to do, as I mentioned, didn't mention actually, during the strategy, but also is that at the country level, we are looking at country engagement strategy that are looking at the key root cause of fragility. If you don't focus on the root cause of fragility, you will be providing some financing, but not necessarily addressing the real issue. That's why I refer in agreement to your point, sir. So the whole point is to say, what are the governance issues? Is there a question of elite capture? Is there a question of inequality, horizontal geographic inequalities? And how to best take that into account when we are providing support, when they are macro-critical. That's, of course, our filter at the IMF, since this is our mandate. And in many countries, I can tell you that the whole governance system is significant. To look at what we can do with other partners, the World Bank as well, and other institutions, in terms of SOE reform, state-owned enterprise, why it's not working, what can be done, and how we can leverage our capacity in this regard. So fully agree with to say it's a key issue for obvious reasons. Secondly, that's why you need to partner with other organizations, including by being more present on the ground. Because, by not just being in Washington, D.C., but by being on the ground, you are going to start to hear voice that you don't necessarily hear from civil society organizations, from actors with whom you are not necessarily engaging daily, providing you information and certainly make you realize that there are some issues that you need to take into account before providing also assistance. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the clock. We still have less than 2 minutes, so I apologize. We won't be able to have another round of questions, but definitely we would have appreciated more time. Eric, before we go to the closing remark of Papa Amadou, I don't know if you would like to answer very quickly the question that was asked by the gentleman, or would you like to have to answer him on the side?
Sure. I guess I just, if I could go back to two different things. One is, I think, talking about the legitimacy and the change in the institutions. I think we need to be very clear about how we get change. The change comes from the shareholders, and Frank has done it, referred to them very nicely, but I think fundamentally the way in which we get change for these institutions is about persuading the major shareholders to effectuate change. And frankly, I think you've seen a lot of movement. You've seen the leadership of President Macron. You've seen the leadership of Secretary Yellen. You've seen the G20 Independent Commission on the capital adequacy. You've seen a lot of first steps, but we need step 2, we need step 3, and we need to start moving down the road more specifically. The other thing I'd say is watch Zambia, because one of the crucial moments in what happens next in these institutions is how the deal with Zambia proceeds, and whether China steps up to the plate and plays a different kind of role in these debt negotiations than it has previously. And so I think that's really, and the tragedy of Yemen I could talk to for a very long time. I spent 2 years trying to advance the peace process, and then it went sideways for 4 years. And so I think now there is real progress and real work on it. But for 4 years it was left alone, and that was a terrible, terrible decision.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you for all of you in the panel. And Papa Amadou, please, the floor is yours for the conclusion.
Great. At the end of the day, the discussion we've been having here, the questions, and then these helped us at IFD to really redesign our strategy around the Minka project, which financing the Shabake in Lebanon. And also, two elements that are critical is how to, have local actors around the table, the beneficiaries, Frank said it, the governments, stakeholders, civil society, everyone on the table, and also to think how the restructuring of the aid architecture take into account climate fragility, but also the multidimensionality of the crisis I've been talking over the last 2 days. And last but not least, for myself, what I call on behalf of the AFD also is when we do this renegotiation of debt, aid, and the whole new aid, strategy, do it at, gatherings where the voices of all nations and actors will be heard. Not only to go to places like, let's say, G7, OECD, G20, etc. Look at places where everyone's voice will be heard, be it this from the African countries, Latin American countries, Asian countries, but also civil society and private sector. Because I will finish by that, today, the most important actors in terms of financing development in the developing or the developed nations is a private capital flows. It is important. Without that, we'll not go far. Thank you so much.